Hi there, my name is Philip Ideson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And today on the show, I'm sharing a recording of a recent AOP Live webinar that we recorded in partnership with Zip. It's titled Unleashing the Power of Generative AI in Procurement. Now, AI has been mainstream long enough that it's now time for procurement to get specific and systematic about where, when, and how to apply it to our tech stack in order to generate the most value for the business. In this episode, Kelly and I spoke with Lance Young, the CEO of ProcureTech, and Nick Heinzmann, head of research at Zip and former analyst at Spend Matters, about current best practices for positioning AI in the tech stack and how procurement can navigate the inherent risks that may accompany digital transformation. We also discussed the value and benefits AI can bring procurement, like optimizing the source-to-pay workflows, data management, compliance, and process efficiencies. So let's get started, where I ask Lance if he can share the differences between AI and generative AI.
Yeah, and I think as well, like there's a different way of looking at it as well, because I think what we've seen with Gen AI has been a catalyst. And whilst AI has been in existence for a period of time, we've hit a tipping point with AI development, which has flipped into generative AI, which has acted as a catalyst for a lot of change, which we'll talk about in the procurement space. At a very basic level, AI basically allows you to analyze and work with historic data sets and allow you to be predictive, whereas generative AI allows itself to be able to model by itself, create new outputs, new different outputs, and hence why you've had some instances of organizations saying, well, it hallucinates. Well, it's actually just being super creative, to be quite honest. So at a very basic level, that's the difference between generative AI and AI.
And what are some of the common themes that you're hearing when you're talking to practitioners, service providers in this space related to generative AI?
Yeah. I mean, obviously, over the last year, it's been sort of exponential, the change and the amount of conversation that's gone on. Last year it was very much about people just basically looking to understand what the implications were, what they could and couldn't do. And we found that, to be quite honest, a lot of the buyers and the users were using it more avidly than the corporates knew that was happening as well. That led to a lot of sort of lockdown of activities and data, whilst people understood what it could do, what it couldn't do, and how much people were prepared to kind of unleash it, as it were. And then over the last 6 months, especially as we head into 2024, we've seen a lot more adoption. It's been specifically around specific use cases, and people effectively running pilots, running activities, running and creating their own private LLMs and the like. But as well, we've seen a lot of the more leading digital solutions basically advance and embed basically generative AI into their solution sets, with many of them as well. And I'm sure Nick will share some of these activities. They've been able to solve one or two problems that they've not been able to solve before. We'll come on to talk about data in a little bit, but basically there's a number of different things they've not been able to solve, which makes it a lot more exciting as well.
Yeah, that drives some of the unknown, but also some of the interest of, is this going to herald a new kind of value proposition? It's not just making, and I say just, it's not to say that flippantly, because that's a big issue and a challenge for us all, but it's not just about efficiency with generative AI. It's about, as you say, trying to have different outcomes, driving different outcomes than what we've been able to do before, at least at scale.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, in everything from traditional data and process all the way to visual and audio as well. As I say, I think we're only really tipping on the edge of what it can do and what AI can do in general. So
Yeah. Now, Nick, for those who don't know, and I'm sure that most people attending today know, you've got a lot of background as an analyst in the procurement space, doing a lot of research in the procurement tech, kind of across the procurement tech stack. You're now working with Zip, who are very heavily focused on procurement orchestration and intake. What kind of role does generative AI play in the procurement orchestration?
I think it's a really interesting question because the two, at least in my mind, are very much linked.
Mm-hmm.
If you step back and you look at the role of procurement orchestration in the tech market or how people are adopting it into their organizations today, you can start to see how AI fits in actually as an accelerant of that larger trend. So if you look at it this way, orchestration started as a new layer, right? It sits on top of everything of what you might call automation layer. There's S2P tools or suites that sit underneath. And orchestration as a value prop provides central control, seamless integration, visibility into everything that sits underneath. Because it's hooked into all of the underlying processes, it also has the unique ability to help optimize those processes, even if they sit across multiple tools. So you can get better insights, easier access to those tools via central intake, smoother cross-functional process in terms of collaboration, approval. AI, in my view, and especially generative AI, is an accelerant of what orchestration is already doing. Because from that top layer, you can embed AI down into any current S2P process without making you necessarily have to adopt a specialized AI within those specific tools or modules. If you could say it another way, it's actually that you can use this approach of orchestration to actually accelerate the adoption of AI use cases into any part of your process. You can lead from top down.
Mm-hmm.
Documents being one example is, if you're starting from any one central point, you can get any document into the process and either route it, but also analyze it and extract the data from it more effectively. So that could be, yes, a contract, but could also be a more specialized document like a SOC 2. That is not necessarily a contract, but something that still needs to be read and routed to the right place, whether that's your IT team, whether that's procurement to review vendor risk, et cetera. All of that actually is now from this top layer more accessible, but then also more easier to analyze and then push the right data into the right systems at the right time. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a different way of thinking about how to apply new innovations from a different perspective.
And interesting to think about something you said there was around it's not kind of restricted to the procurement process and improvements in one tool. You can actually improve other tools within your tech stack by using generative AI that are not necessarily built into those inherently, but you're kind of bringing it's almost like an oversight and an AI generated consulting tool to some of the other things to kind of connect some of those gaps, if you are. I know that's not a great way of explaining it, but it's just interesting to think about it going beyond just the individual piece of software.
I think, Phil, just building on both comments, because what Nick said there very simply, it's worthwhile people listening to again, because what he's articulated is the difference between, the 90s software in at the start of the decade, so Ariba, Oracle, and others, then what we saw in the next decade-ish with best of breed and what we've got now. And the reason why I call that out is because if you were built in the 90s or in the start of the century, it's a lot harder for you to basically start to ingest and integrate and build new technology into your platform. Whereas if you were built in the last few years, it's natural. It's a natural extension. You can build that in. But then there's a second layer to what Nick said was yes, provide a fantastic orchestration layer, but also effectively build the new contract management lifecycle management solution. So yes, there's an element of the click in, the click out, but there's also, well, how do you capture not only structured data but unstructured data that comes from your emails? And that feeds into some of the things that Nick and team are doing on the intake side of things, whether it's hooking into your teams and other things. So it's not just the hooking into your CLM solution, but it's also creating a new workflow, a new data source, and then, as I said at the start, then manipulating the data in a different way, taking unstructured and structured data and manipulating it in a different way to get a different outcome as well.
So with that comment about data is interesting. I want to bring up actually we always run a survey before an AOP Live of the AOP community. We run it on LinkedIn just to kind of get a pulse check. And the polls that we run on LinkedIn, we're limited to 4 answers. But I wanted to share with you the one that we posed in advance of today's conversation. And I'm going to read this out for anybody who might be listening to this as a podcast, perhaps later if you're not seeing the video. The question we asked was, what do you see as the primary benefit of embedding AI in the procurement tech stack? So what do you see as the primary benefit of embedding AI in the procurement tech stack? And the number one response that we got was accelerated process workflows at 55%. Second was predictive demand analytics at 16%. And actually tied in third and fourth was more intuitive user experience at 14% and fewer data quality issues also at 14%. Now, before I go to you, Lance, to ask for your perspective, Nick, anything that stands out from you on those results?
There's nothing that really surprises me here because this is how I'd expect this poll to go over time. But I think actually the availability of the other options kind of shows where we're going. Largely today, if anyone has played with a generative AI tool, they know it's an efficiency play. And that's actually how a lot of people are making the pitch for this even to a CFO. I've read research on how to make the pitch for Copilot at Microsoft to a CFO. And it's a productivity thing. I mean, a talent crunch. Longer term, though, I think what's going to be really interesting is people move past this initial phase of seeing the basic benefit. They're going to look towards these other ones as the next level that they have to work harder for, and the vendors are going to have to work harder for to make it work. But these are the next frontiers, and I think people are starting to imagine what that's going to be. The data quality is one I'll love to pick on. A lot of people say that this is the big thing that's going to hold people back, that the models need to be trained on better data, more data, et cetera. I think another way to think about it, though, is that especially generative AI, which you can link it with the rise of intake, but it flips this on its head. It's actually a different way of collecting data. And generative AI is actually quite good at transforming data. If you give it one, you can flip it to another format pretty quickly. So actually this streamlining a collection of data, it can help start with the resolution of data quality issues by making the process of collecting data better, in a word. It can make it faster, but it can also make it so that you can collect data in the right format. You can ping and go back and forth and actually make it more collaborative to get the data in. And then by the time it's actually stored or processed in another system, you're more confident that it's actually the right data. So in my view, again, going back to the earlier question, these two things are really connected. But longer term, I think people haven't fully understood, beyond their own personal use case, they've made them more effective. But now when they look at these next ones, they're going to see, well, could it do this? And that's a central theme, is really testing out where it could go.
Yeah, it's kind of improving over time, getting a use case that you can build a business case around as well. And then realizing, I think with a lot of these technologies, you don't necessarily realize the power, nor can you imagine the art of the possible for them until you start playing around with them.
Yeah.
Lance, any thoughts or comments from you on the results?
Just building on that as well. I think, yes, you're right to a degree. It's influenced a little bit by the structure of the question as well. And, yes, the instant response would be process workflows, productivity play. But basically, a process workflow is only as successful as the data that's being run off. Because fundamentally, you're taking data points, decisions that allow you to basically then take the next step or follow the next part of the process. And what we're seeing with a lot of the process orchestration platforms, it's the surfacing of that data as well, that basically is actually creating more dashboards, more information, more more intelligence that you can actually do things with as well. So, I'd personally argue that, the primary benefit of AI is more the quality of the data and the intelligence of the data that you're going to get, and therefore the kind of the innovation and creativity is going to come off that rather than the workflow. But I know you need both to be successful.
Yeah, I think what's going to be interesting is the data quality, and we talk about this all the time at procurement as well, is a problem that we've never really solved for. we've been trying to work on solving for it for a long time. So actually, there's so many different things that are possible when we have more consistency and trust in the data quality that we have. And so you kind of fix that, and then it opens up a whole new world of possibilities, which go beyond just generative AI and those possibilities. But it's interesting, as you say, to see that that's kind of at the bottom of the list there. But as Nick said, it's kind of you go in and think, where's it going to help me most immediately today versus what could be the long-term benefit. I see that Ahmed has asked a question. I'm going to come back to this later, just as we kind of fit it into the conversation. But Kelly, I want to bring you in and just ask if you have any thoughts on what you're seeing from both from the survey and some of the things that Lance and Nick have shared with us so far today.
Well, I do think it's so interesting. Procurement is constantly changing and evolving, and sometimes it actually makes it easy to forget some of the progress that we've made. Now, I look at accelerated process workflows and think, that's a customer-centric function, right? Because accelerating process workflows, sure, it gets us to the end of our projects faster, but more directly, it helps other people in the company be happier working with procurement. And so I almost wonder if this is, while it's showing where our focus is around generative AI today and showing some of the places we can go, predictive demand analytics and future data quality investments, I actually wonder if it's showing something about the pendulum swing on customer-centric procurement. For so long, Lance talked about software designed in the 90s and early 2000s. And if there was one thing we heard consistently, is that it was not user-friendly, it was not intuitive, you had to go to multi-day training sessions. Well, if we're at the point where we're accelerating process workflows, you would like to think that also means we've invested in those workflows so that it's safe to make them go faster. So while we may not be as mature as we will be around the applications of AI generally and generative AI more specifically, I actually take it as a hugely good sign that we're thinking about how our processes affect the rest of the company, which of course then loops back to us in terms of the results that we're able to drive. Now, as I pull this down, Lance, we've talked about where AI can start to fit into the procurement tech stack. And obviously, different organizations have different areas of focus. Are there some common places that you're seeing that if procurement is going to make a concerted effort to say, we want to use AI somewhere, there are a few key places that are sort of the most common test spots for bringing that in?
Yeah, and it's good to delineate between process orchestration versus Gen AI, because in predictions we made last year, the two come together very, very closely. It's a kind of a hotspot of combining two advanced technologies together to get a better outcome, as Nick said at the start. But there are unique use cases, and Ahmed's question here is spot on. Is generative AI going to be used in RFPs and contract drafting? If you're not doing it already, then you're behind 100%. Whether it's basically in the generation of a contract, the review of a contract, or the creation of an RFP, the identification of suppliers, it's being applied in all those different places as well. In some instances, it's very, very open, and people are using OpenAI, and some organizations are happy with that. In other instances, it's private LLMs, and those are either within the walls of the business or within the product that you're using as well. So the core elements of procurement are being augmented with generative AI. The question is less about will and where, and more about the kind of the pace and the skills, as you called out, Kelly, that you need there to be able to work with AI.
Yeah. Now, to your point on pace, are you seeing teams pilot either AI directly or applications that have AI already embedded? Or do people seem to just generally be taking for granted, no, this is the way of the future. We don't need to pilot it. Sure, we'll do a careful implementation, but we're committing. We know this is the way that we're going. But what's sort of the confidence level around approach that you're seeing?
it is mixed between the pilot and just, yes, we're going to deploy the solution. And it depends on two things. It depends on the corporation that's looking to adopt the technology, but also the solution as well. If you're using a solution like Zip, where it's embedded, it's proven, you got hundreds of customers using it, there's a lot more assuredness of everything from data quality to security with the solution versus something that's maybe a nascent solution. It's not to say that one is better than the other. It's just the corporation needs to decide how they want that solution to fit into their core, their overall platform as well. But rest assured, it's being adopted. Full stop.
Yeah.
And many people won't even know it, by the way. They'll just be using it.
It'll be secret AI.
What?
I think that's ultimately what everybody's hoping for. We won't even have to learn how to use it. It's just going to be all baked in. Don't even worry about it. You're just getting the benefits.
Well,
Nick,
idea though, because from our experience, a lot of people really do want to know exactly where it is and where it's coming from.
Yeah.
And that's you mentioned we've been piloting this. We have hundreds of customers looking at the idea of using it. But the key thing we've put into the design framework around this is knowing when something is an AI generated or not, and giving the ability to, where reasonable, toggle it on or off. People really asked for that because they want to understand not only when their data might be going somewhere, which for what it's worth, we have a zero data retention policy with OpenAI and how we work with them, but the way that people can understand the auditability of where a specific data point has come from, or if it really goes with the overall trend, right? We don't want a black box of this. So the embedding is important and to make it seamless, but highlighting very clearly where something comes from AI, where it's being used versus not, so they can query, and then also give feedback. Every time we give an instance of using AI in our platform, we offer the ability also to provide feedback to what the output was. That helps us refine over time as well. We don't want to make this promise or overpromise of what it can do today. We want to actually collaboratively build and test with you all. So really, it's about a question of how do we embed this in a way that makes it useful, but not necessarily embed it so it's behind the scenes and you don't know where it's coming from.
Yeah.
Can I just jump in with one question for Nick? Based on that, Nick, do you find that there is tolerance for that it may still be experimental in terms of the results versus there's an expectation that it's going to work 100% out of the box, be perfect the first time, and if it's not, then people saying, I'm not going to try this again because this is obviously not ready for prime time.
In my experience, people are quite tolerant of understanding this is a new technology. And the key to that is how you design and implement it the right way. If you throw this at people and say it'll fix all your problems, then their expectation is that it's going to need to be near perfect. If, however, you're approaching this with the ability to make it very easy to correct an error or take a recommendation, but not have the system actually be an agent and do the action, if you're reviewing the action that's suggested beforehand, it makes it much more trustworthy. And I think really the idea here is people understand, hey, it would be cool, be amazing if this could 100% automate some of this workflow away. But even if it automates 80% and I have to tweak something to get it to work right, that's still a pretty big gain. And it's really about bringing AI to the table to give it a chance to show you what it can do. We're all trying to figure that out still, I think, is the real answer to that question. But people are open to it with the correct presentation and giving them a collaborative approach into not only using, testing it, but providing feedback to move things in the right direction. It's like we've seen for a long time, even in contract analytics. And, I used to cover CLM pretty intensively. There was obviously this great promise of you have a set of clauses in your clause library. You can find them in third-party paper. You can always identify it the right way. But there's always new clauses and there's new scenarios that show up, and people over time want to adapt to these things. So to expect that even a highly trained tool will work 100% of the time is a bit of a fantasy because the world changes. I always think of the great example of when LIBOR was retired as a benchmark. That had to be adapted to something else. And people need to constantly adapt these things. So even a system that works really, really well will never work 100% well forever. So having that approach of not expecting perfection is important not only for testing a new technology, but for living with the technology over time.
Yeah. Well, and to that point, we've seen the enthusiasm curve for AI. It's straight up, right? But the learning curve is a little bit more gradual. And so I can see where even some of the things that we've talked about in not quite half an hour here, right? OpenAI versus private LLMs, data retention policy, some of these different things, procurement has to not only learn a new set of acronyms, hooray for that, but we have to educate ourselves about the benefits as well as the things that we need to consider as we make decisions. So, Nick, in the conversations that you're having, how prepared do you tend to find procurement teams, not necessarily to have all the answers, but to ask really good contextualized questions so that they know they're making the right recommendations or the right decisions as the situation might be about how and where they bring AI into the tech stack?
It's a mixed bag. And honestly, it really varies based on size, maturity of the company, but also what sector they're in.
Yeah.
I think, for example, if you talk to different kinds of Zip customers, you get different kinds of answers. If you talk to a very tech-forward company out of Silicon Valley that's been using Zip for intake to pay, for example, they might be gung-ho about it. They might have been testing multiple models. They're like, oh yeah, I use Claude, I use OpenAI, I've got a whole set of tools I'm using in my daily job already. If you're talking with a larger organization, Fortune 500 financial services, things like large consumer businesses that are maybe more cautious, more slow, they may be aware, but they're not necessarily as prepared because they've already got so much going on, so much that they're already orchestrating, that they're still trying to figure out when the right use case is and how to do it the most cautiously while still getting the benefit. There's just so many legacy processes or legacy tech debt that people are still working through. Yeah. You won't want to go through and necessarily promise AI as this panacea. And I think really in the tech market, there's that straight up, as you said, right? There's questions if we're reaching the end of that straight up and starting to peak a little bit on the excitement. It's starting to get more real. So I think the focus going forward will really be on like, how do I create and give people consumable, concrete use cases with this? Mm-hmm. And that will be increasingly embedded into the experience. When I was talking about earlier, like bringing it in from the orchestration layer down, it's about putting these opportunities in for people to use it, get the value out of it, or give them the ability to give feedback on how it is or isn't working for them. So we don't see the same adoption issues, the same navigation issues that we saw with other technologies. I think really there's a lot of promise here for sure. People see that, but what they're less sure about is how to go about starting to embed this. I think on the tech provider side, at least speaking from the perspective of a vendor, it's our job to make this incredibly intuitive and very transparent about how and what we're doing so that people can trust and refine this over time with us. Everyone is going to be not just fine-tuning their models, but fine-tuning how they use AI in their daily lives.
And of course, there's no change or technology that gets brought in without accompanying process change, right, Lance? So if we think about, as Nick talks about, I love this idea that the enthusiasm curve is flattening off because it's getting real. And so we need to start asking some of these tougher questions, some of them of ourselves, and some of them are the companies we're potentially working with. What would you say are some of the questions that procurement should be asking outside the company, inside the company, just to make sure that they're going on their own learning journey, but they're also gathering the basis needed to make good decisions?
Yeah, and I think those are set of important questions, not just for procurement, but the fact that procurement also is responsible for buying a lot of the AI that's applied throughout the organization as well. And much like Nick, what we've seen is kind of a split in terms of the ability and aptitude of organizations to ask the right questions. Funnily enough, the organizations that are small, that have a small procurement team, have typically been the organizations that have gone, right, I'm kind of all in. They're more ready to receive. They're more ready to take advantage of the productivity advantages that you're going to get from adopting a new processes, new ways of working, because historically there wasn't anything there anyway. And what you're getting now is the user-centric journey that you're looking for as well, versus a bigger organization where I normally start by asking a question about at the top, basically the leadership behaviors that exist. the leadership digital quotient that exists, and then it cascades down into the way that people operate from the processes, their buying behaviors, all the way through into your suppliers, and whether or not the suppliers have got the ability to work on a digital basis with you as well. What you do find, especially say with the bigger organizations, is there is a significant amount of change that has to be done, because you've got the leaders, you've got the fast followers, but then you've got a massive cliff. The people that are behind that they're keeping the show on the road. They're doing their jobs, and it is a change often in the way that they're going to be working. And some are bothered about it, and others aren't. They're just doing their day job. And so it's harder when you move from a small mid-size organization into working the change to an enterprise as well. And you have to go about the whole change journey in a slightly different way.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think that comes back to your point, Phil, talking about how forgiving are people. And it's one thing for those of us here today, the vast majority are going to take a procurement perspective. There's a lot of change that needs to happen, but we can't get so fixated on the tech or even on the process that we allow that pendulum to swing away and to forget about the user experience. I mean, from a usability perspective, procurement will accept the equivalent of a cardboard box with duct tape on it, right? Because we've seen us do it. We will make do with like whatever old rickety thing, but we've come a long way, and our platforms don't have to be like that anymore. Do we have to be careful in thinking about how the places that we've rolled in AI don't have to go back through that sort of user acceptance and improvement cycle that we've been through in the past, but that we can sort of benefit from the raised expectations and make sure that anything new that we bring in now that happens to have AI in it is already somewhat closer to where our users expect solutions to be?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions I'd maybe ask people to think about. And the first one's not an obvious one, which is, what is the benefit I'm going to get from AI? Because often what happens is you can't see it. Classic is at the intake stage, there's a huge amount of intelligence that's embedded through the AI in the intake, but you can't see it. So you need to be kind of clear, well, okay, where's the AI? What's the benefit I'm going to get? And show me. If you're interested, then show me. Some people are just not, by the way, they say it's better, so it doesn't matter, but that'd be one thing. The second one, which is an obvious one, which is all of the technical security side of things, the cybersecurity, the ethical nature, those questions that run through it. But then the third is, how am I going to maintain this? How am I going to run with this? How am I going to be able to improve this? Because it's a different operating model than what it was when you just accepted Ariba out of the box. Now there's a lot more accountability and responsibility of procurement and their central digital teams to basically own it, but also continue to build it as well.
Absolutely. And of course, we have to be mindful of risk, right? Nick, you talked about data retention. I know that's a huge concern. Even looking at InfoSec questionnaires, right, are some of the things that we need to be reviewing and continuing to educate ourselves about. Phil, I can actually see that a couple of questions have come in, and I don't know if you've been keeping an eye as I've been chatting with Lance and Nick, but I thought I would check in with you to see if there's anything we should pause here and address. Yeah,
there's a question that's come from Wayne, and there's actually a couple of questions. I'll ask the second one first, and that's, are there any examples of how AI is used in a manufacturing procurement environment? Either Nick or Lance, I'm interested if you've seen anything out there in the wild that addresses specifically manufacturing, or platforms that you see that can be adapted for manufacturing procurement or direct procurement.
I mean, here's the thing, guys. Pretty much, if you've got a platform you're using at the minute, I'd be shocked if there isn't some form of AI in there, one way or another. So it's degrees of deployment of AI and generative AI that you're looking for, and you can do a relatively straight line correlation between the age of the original tech architecture and the amount of AI that's going to be naturally deployed within them as well, as a percentage of the overall capability of that solution. And as well, the speed of adoption of AI, again, will be greater in some of the newer platforms that are out there, or the new ones that are spinning up, every day as well. So I could list off a list of different digital solutions, or you could basically check out any of the lists that exist out there.
And actually, there's another question that came in. Nick, I'm going to ask you this one, because this may play in kind of with your past role as an analyst overlooking a number of different platforms as well. It's come from Paul. Paul says, what's the compatibility of the major ERP systems such as SAP, Oracle, Dynamics with generative AI?
It's an interesting question, because it really positions how you think about ERP and the role of that system within your organization, but also your larger tech stack. There's obviously an opportunity for generative AI in ERP. And if you look at any public announcement from these corporations, take SAP as an example, this is absolutely something they're doubling down on, with the messaging that, we have more data, more experience with this area than, most other companies. Oracle beg to differ, obviously. But because of that, they feel positioned to build off of that. It's also, let's be honest, a selling point for cloud transitions. A lot of people are still, working their way from on-prem or customized systems into the cloud world. It's a carrot for a lot of people to get going. I think the interesting thing, though, is that the compatibility of this, it goes on how you're going to do it. Because if you contrast SAP and Oracle has made a big public positioning statement about embedding their AI and saying that within specific concrete use cases, it'll be table stakes so that everyone will have it. And that's a different position than SAP, for example, which is using it more of a carrot, as like, we've got all this data, we've got all these capabilities. So we want you to modernize with us. And I think there's a case for both. But with respect to ERP, it's a question of what are you doing or not doing in that system, and where do processes happen? There's a question of what you should be doing using AI for ERP versus in another place. And again, this goes back to the role of orchestration. And a lot of this is that as you look at the stack of how organizations work with their financial processes, their procurement processes, ERP, for better or worse, has really become a financial information layer. It's a backbone. It's a database. It is not necessarily where processes sit, because actually processes feed ERP as a system of record. As you move up the stack, it's a question of how do I get better data in those processes to feed my downstream ERP. And that's where the compatibility of AI is actually really coming in, because it's a question of how do I not only make these processes more efficient, but more accurate, so that the entire stack lines up correctly. You can't think of them necessarily in isolation, I would argue.
Yeah, 100%. It's all part of one ecosystem. They can't be seen in isolation. The ERP, as people normally view it, is your backbone, transactional, data driven. Any changes that are made are going to take longer to be made within those environments. But basically, they are changing as well. And it's not new news. The newer solutions or the process orchestration platforms are moving at a faster speed to adopt AI and generative AI as well. But it has to be seen as one complete stack as well.
All right. Well, thank you there for the question, Paul. Now, we had another question that came in the chat, and do please keep these questions coming. I'll pose as many as we can to Lance and Nick through the remaining 50 minutes or so. Question from Alex, which actually ties in with something I was going to ask you, Lance. Is there anything that we need to be worried about? What should our primary concerns be, or should we have any primary concerns as procurement leaders when it comes to generative AI?
Okay, so the procurement singularity. So there's this philosophical place in time where basically computational power exceeds human intelligence, and there's various theories out in the world that basically talk to it happening somewhere between 2030, which is only 5 years away, maybe 5.5, depending on look at it, and 2045 as well. And so the one thing I would call out to people is you can either be a passenger in this whole kind of evolution of procurement, or you can stand up and get included. My biggest worry is that people within procurement will be a passenger. They'll not shape their own destination, and therefore basically you'll be dictated to. Yeah, that's my biggest worry, and we don't have enough leaders to basically create the change and lead the change as well.
Nick, any thoughts from you? Anything we should be worried about? Oh, I love, Lance, how you answered about, because we believe, entirely in the fact you've got to be in control of your own destiny. You've got to experiment. You've got to be part of the change as opposed to just being passive in the change. But Nick, from a risk perspective in AI, is there anything that we should worry about, or is there anything that you think about that is important, that is mitigated as you're designing AI into your tech stack?
There's certainly risks. And actually, I think the biggest one in my view is around your own employees and your team. It becomes really a trust issue, because if you understand how these things work, you understand the idea that you can prompt the system to do anything you want it to, in a way. And in fact, what a lot of people are going to do is they're going to start potentially using this to manipulate it. And I think you really need to step back and look at it as a kind of tool. It's a technology. I mean, even fire, right? Originally, I'm sure fire was used to cook meat and make our lives better and keep the night open, until someone decided I could also use it to burn your hut down. So it's really a question of then, I'm going to unleash this tool on my team. Can I trust them to use it effectively? Can I trust them to not use it in a way that might accidentally cause discrimination? Am I going to use it in a way that will generate insights that are correct, or am I going to manipulate that process in the right way, or in maybe a negative way to fit a story that I'm trying to push? So it's really going to be a question of not only just what the tools do, but exactly how people are using the tools, and then kind of up-leveling the ethics and the training on how people apply the technology correctly, that I see as a bigger risk. It's it's a leadership opportunity for people, but you don't want to be so eager as to put this tool in the hands of people you don't necessarily trust. And that's why being very careful about the use cases and the parameters of the use cases is going to be really important.
Yeah, I'd echo that. And two angles. One is, remember, this is all about empowering the business and empowering the suppliers. And that's, if you're magnifying Nick's point there about trust, that's how you need to feel. You need to feel confident that you're giving a solution to the business so that they can basically go about buying what they want to buy. And then the second aspect is somebody being technically strong enough to delineate between where you can put generative AI versus where you don't. So as long as there's problem with hallucination, do you want it in your sourcing optimization engine or not? Now, Alan Holland from Keelvar, CEO there and ex-scientist out of university in Dublin, would say don't. Yeah. So I would follow Alan, at least for the time being, on that. But the key thing is having somebody technically able to be able to decide where it goes and where it doesn't go, and is prepared to kind of step forward and make an opinion and lead in that instance as well.
The whole trust thing is really interesting to me, and something, Nick, you talked about right at the beginning is around the toggle. I'm thinking, can you essentially game is not the right word, but kind of test or have hypothesis against, like, what is the output of something if it is AI and generative AI enabled versus if it's not, to then get trust in the use kit, the way that you're using generative AI is leading to a result that is, an optimal result versus one that's taking you down in the wrong direction, and the fact that you're showing your users when generative AI is being used and when it's not. Is that something that we can apply more to, you're kind of doing even like scenario testing. I'm going to test this thing. I'm going to test it with the generative AI. I'm going to test it without, and I'm going to do a compare and contrast. And that's how I'm going to get confidence and trust in the generative AI.
Yeah, we're seeing it with the degrees of automation. So some platforms enabling you to kind of go, well, how much automation do you want? How many steps do you want to remove? How much of the recommendations does the AI automatically make, or your assistant make? I haven't seen it with Gen AI on or off in a live environment. I've seen it demoed, but not in a live environment. Not yet, anyway.
Nick, do you think that's something that that companies will pursue the ability to, or it's going to be an all or nothing, kind of the switch is on or the switch is off?
Oh, I mean, at least from the way we've designed and worked with a lot of people, that's 100% been the appetite. Is there's a question of, well, let me put it this way. Not every workflow, not every scenario is the same. And this is something we've really emphasized with our largest enterprise clients. When you're working with 20,000 employees in a publicly traded environment, there's some things that need to be more hidden and some things that are more sensitive than the standard request, or if I want to go buy something that can easily fit on a virtual card. Having that dynamism is very important to a large organization that needs this not only in the realm of AI, but also in terms of permissions, in terms of routing to the right people. I think of one example, a company that went public on Zip. They needed to make sure that some of the stuff related to the IPO work was not necessarily publicly viewed by the rest of the team. So they would be able to route things effectively just to the group of people who are working on this project. I think really with AI, if you take a step back and look at all of that, you're going to want to be able to selectively say, like, I don't want every document to pass through this engine to be shredded and analyzed. Maybe some documents need to be kept private. And the ability to turn things on or off becomes a really big part of that. I mean, you take sourcing as another example. Sometimes I want to be able to help automatically populate an RFP or given the opportunity. But if this is something that is something I've done a lot of research on already, I have the info, I don't need you to push it at me. I can just fill it out myself. So that optionality, really, you think of AI as like another person, but at least at this state, not like a very capable person, more like, I've read this in other places, you think of it more like an intern.
Yeah.
Really, really excited to work with you, really excited to give you a high output, maybe not necessarily the best output.
Trust the sources and the interpretation.
Yeah.
Dig deeper into those rather than trusting at face value.
Yeah, exactly.
We've had a couple of really interesting questions. I do want to come to those in a minute, but I just want to go back, as we think about implementation, and we've talked about, in fact, Lance was talking about the fact that, and I made a note of this as he was talking, it's easier for smaller teams oftentimes to experiment with generative AI, and I think a large part of that is down to the change management. Nick, I want to ask you around, because it ties in with the survey that we did right at the beginning when we looked at process acceleration, for example, versus data. Does it reduce the risk of experimenting with AI and generative AI when you're looking to implement on an internal procurement process, for example, rather than something that may touch multiple different stakeholders? Is it a much more controlled environment and maybe an easier place to start?
It certainly is. And from what we've seen in just one example, like we've worked a lot in the orchestration space, especially the front end of it being with intake. Like if you want to give your policy to AI and make it queryable, that's a defined specific use case. It's a very clear data set of policy rules. It's ingestible by a generative AI because it's more text-based versus numeric. That kind of approach, it reduces the risk. And also, if an AI spits out an answer that's not 100% accurate, at least at first blush, you're not really going to risk the whole process. You're going to, you're going to route back to the original process. The more it works, though, the more trust you build into the process. I think the risks, though, is the bigger. It's about sizing the use case and sizing the prize, right? The bigger you get, the more general it gets, the harder it is. And I think of, for example, the feedback that Microsoft has gotten on Copilot in its own applications recently. There are different modes for only internal data versus can I query the web? There's a wall between them to protect internal data. But people find that experience very jarring. And that's actually the feedback, is that there's a learning curve of having to toggle between the two things and knowing when I'm on the web versus internal data. I think the challenge of this is people first encountered a lot of generative AI as a general purpose technology in the form of ChatGPT. And they are used to these things being fully integrated in their consumer experience. Making the B2B experience clunkier for specific, security reasons is a negative, at least on the adoption aspect and how effective it is. And that's actually what Microsoft, frankly, has heard in their feedback, is that even though it's based on OpenAI, the Copilot version of OpenAI is less effective and doesn't give as high quality outputs as the actual ChatGPT experience, which, for many people is free or $20 a month.
Yeah.
So yes, it does reduce the risk, but it also reduces the applicability and the power, because people are expecting the power they get from this general purpose experience they've had. And thus, when they encounter it in a really neat, tidy use case, they're happy it works, but they're also not as happy with. I mean, they're like, okay, that's nice, but is it transformative? Not necessarily so, not yet.
There's a question that came in from, because I think it builds a little bit on that, from Amit. And you talked about people being used to using ChatGPT in their personal lives, for example, and the power that it gives to do personal level tasks, but not necessarily things that you may want to, that doesn't have that enterprise kind of security associated with it. And his question is, we're talking about big topics like orchestration and workflows, but where does Gen AI, a simple use case for a procurement professional, lie? For example, writers use Gen AI for inspiration in writing. Is there anything that is an easy, quick, out of the box, I can use it tomorrow use case?
I'm going to be cheeky with this, and I think Amit knows the answer, because Amit and anybody who's on this webinar will have been on ChatGPT, and you can basically enter into ChatGPT and ask, what are the top 5 or 10 use cases, and it'll give you a very clear description of the use cases, and it ranges from generation of a contract, review of a contract, comparison of a contract, consolidation of supplier performance data to basically select a new supplier. We have talked heavily about process orchestration and the recommendations from one step to the other, and these are the everyday activities that we do as procurement people. Generative AI are going to help. They're going to streamline. They're going to give us a productivity play, which is fantastic. The people who are going to benefit from this most, by the way, are people that are working on our middle office and the shared office teams, basically where it's going to give them a huge amount of productivity, especially the lower performers, because you're going to get a fast track. You're going to get generate me the top 5 assessment criteria for electronics suppliers in this particular country, and whereas the high performers can go, well, it's bang 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 bang. The low performers are going to go, I can't remember, I didn't learn, and it's there for you. So we're going to see a huge amount of productivity across the whole of procurement, which will then, will allow us all to kind of move on and manage the relationships with the business stakeholders, or manage the suppliers, or think about other creative uses for AI and generative AI. So Amit, it's a trick question you just asked us there, and I think you probably answer it yourself, honestly.
I do find going and just asking very generic situational questions around strategy gives you at least some starting points, doesn't it?
It does. It gives you a percentage of the answer, and then you've got to basically apply your own judgment on top of that, or use it as a starting point to engage with a broader community. We've used it in the simple use cases, but it's often most powerful is as you do, Phil and Kelly. You convene a group of people together, and you use the output, and then you iterate on it as a group. Kind of an accelerated think tank. So there's different ways of kind of bringing it into your everyday life, especially in the creative spaces.
So I have a couple last questions, just the last 5 minutes. Nick, I'm going to ask you one that came in through Q&A, and then Nick, I've just got one for you to kind of finish off the conversation as well. So Bogdan asked, it feels like it's a little bit of a leading question. Don't you feel the market is flooded with procurement solutions, advertising as having a Gen AI component? So my question really is, based off that comment, how do you figure out what's been natively built, with AI in mind versus what may be just a little bit more advertising hype? Or does it matter? Is it just all about the output?
Oh, I think it does matter. And look, I wouldn't be true to my own past, having been an advisor to people selecting these tools, if I didn't give you, some advice to say, you need a set of questions that you can apply with any vendor that you can go interrogate. Candidly, even like the way I would approach evaluating systems as an analyst for my own work was, the advice I was given when I was trained was find out where the system breaks. So you can see a demo and that's all nice. Well, then you just have to wonder, well, what else can it do? And if you keep pushing it, one example too is as soon as I got access to our AI, I started trying to break it. I was throwing foreign languages at it. I threw non-Latin character languages at it. And it did work actually, which was the fun discovery for me. But in terms of the advertising, I think if you look at it on the two axes, it's like, there's left and right. On one hand, it's like what can you do with the prompting in terms of going all the way from the basics to retrieval augmented generation, giving more context, improving the context window. And the other one is like, how much can I improve the model? Like, how much can I fine tune this to be from generic to specific to the data I want? What you want to do in a very basic way is push the prompts, see and ask people like, how are you doing the prompting behind the scenes? What context are you giving? And then what are you putting in the context window? And that'll help you understand if they're just plugging in an OpenAI API and then letting it run through, or if there's some level of prompting behind it that is going through.
Analyzing or interpreting or contextualizing the information.
Yeah. And then the same thing is like, how much data can you take in here? And then how much data, fine. Can you take in my contract repository? Great. Can I then add to or adjust the model over time? Which is something, we've looked at very much as we started, because we wanted it to be trustworthy with our own AI on documents with a very specific set of use cases and specific kinds of clauses. We said, yeah, you can trust this. Where we've gone though, is now we've got to the point where it's like, okay, you want to add in new clauses. You want to add in your own model. That's the next step. Yeah. So that's really the thing, is over time, we need to start thinking about how does this grow? But you've those these of context and prompting, and then also the data set and where you're going and how you're fine tuning or adding to data over time. You can knock out a lot of veneers very quickly.
Yeah. And a different way of looking at it as well is, and I 100% agree with the what you read on the websites and in marketing materials is can be a little bit sort of misleading. It's a problem, to be quite honest, with not just the digital solutions but also with procurement. Are we 100% clear what we do and how we do it as well? The way that we often look at organizations, yes, we assess the regular metrics, but we also look at some fundamentals around the organization itself. So what are the basic capabilities within the organization? So one of the things that got me engaged with Zip from day one was the strength of their engineering team and their background for the amount of quality lines of code that they were creating that basically in their previous roles. And that's part of what you look for. You look for engineering capability. You look for engineering nous. You look for number of patents submitted. You look for these capability drivers that ultimately will show in the performance of an organization as well, beyond just what they're saying on the website.
Well, lots of questions there to ask, and unfortunately we have run out of time. We've got some more questions that came in throughout the conversation. Kelly and I have more of our own, but this was a really rich discussion, just really digging more into generative AI for procurement and use cases, things to be concerned about, things to take advantage of. And Lance, as you said, it's all about taking control of your own destiny and really learning, understanding, and testing and experimenting. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today in today's webinar. And Nick and Lance, thank you so much for joining us and sharing some of your experience with us.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.